Well, I'm Joanna Acevedo for the Great Lakes Review, interviewing Zach Goldberg, who is a writer, educator, and organizer from Durham, North Carolina. He is the author of XV from Nomadic Press 2020 and the winner of the 2021 Button Chapbook Contest. Congratulations.
Thank you.
His work can be found or is forthcoming in Agni, Washington Square Review, New South, and elsewhere. Zach has represented Wesleyan University and Berkeley tournaments. He lives on occupied Dakota land in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Thank you for being here, Zach.
Thanks so much for being with me.
A lot of these poems in XV are about history and destiny. Can you speak to the sense of trying to escape the inevitable and what your thoughts are on destiny as a poetic concept?
Yeah. So I think that is a great word that I would not have used for the book, which is destiny, but I think it's like super accurate. And I think that destiny is like a sense of inevitability. And that's, I think, definitely a lot of what I was trying to portray is like an inevitability of history becoming manifest in the present. But I think it's interesting because, like, as a person, I don't actually feel that destiny is necessarily a helpful concept. And maybe that's part of what, like, this book was like written to figure out in a way, is like, I think destiny is, the story you tell yourself about what's possible. And that can be super harmful. Because I think you limit, what's possible, you limit yourself. It's a romantic notion. It's like a fantasy notion. Like, that's what I think of when I think of destiny, is like, this is a story about what's happening, but not necessarily what is actually happening, if that makes any sense at all. And I think, like, you're so right to pick that out of this collection. And I think, at least I hope, what some of this collection does is like subvert the idea of destiny, and like that it's acknowledging and like poking fun at it, and like talking about how destiny is not, it is fake. It's, again, it's a story that we tell ourselves, and like it is oftentimes very unhelpful. Yeah, I don't know if that really answers the question.
No, I think it definitely does, and I think there's also a lot of humor in it that comes through. So how did the collection come about? What was the writing process like? And what was did it come easily, or was there a lot of labor that came in writing it?
Yeah. I come from a background of spoken word and like poetry slam, and that really teaches, or at least the way that it came to me was like, you write a lot of very discrete pieces, that are sort of, they deal with similar themes, but are not necessarily like relate in relationship with one another, if that makes sense. Um, and so I think it never really like was a possibility. Like, I never let myself have the possibility in my brain that like I could write a collection of like interrelated pieces. But I sort of started realizing that a lot of the work I was writing for Poetry Slam, or like with that intention, were like living in the same world. And then I I guess like it was very clear that it could be a chapbook, because I think I just really was in love with the chapbook as a form, like as a container at that point. Because it's just so, I don't know, it's like so compact, and like it feels like an opportunity to be very specific. And like also just on a totally like material plane, like I love going to an event and like buying like 4 chapbooks. Like, just like they're cheap, they're fun, they're small, like they're a really good way to get at somebody's work. And so I was like, oh, this could definitely be a chapbook. The concept sort of developed out of like these poems that I had already written, and then being like, oh, if I want it to be the length of a chapbook, it needs to be like so and so pages. And by the time that happened, I had probably like half of the material that was ready. And then I feel like, because there is like a clear, the book itself has sort of like a form to it that like sort of needed to be filled in. Like it counts to 15 essentially. And so I was like, oh, I have like 9 poems. I need 6 more. Where in this arc could they, or like would they fit? And so I think definitely closer to like the end of the writing process, I was like, oh, like I need a 14th poem. Oh, I need a 5th poem, because the sequencing of it was pretty, it came pretty naturally, I think, actually. There was a little bit of messing around, but I feel like because of like the form of it, I like understood where everything should lay and should fit. So yeah, I don't know. It came about naturally at first, and then once I realized what it was, I sort of was like, oh, okay, I need to like buckle down and like write this specific poem that like does this thing in this moment. And I did that with probably 4 or 5 poems.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's also how I found that most of my books come together, is that you don't realize that they're coming until they're like halfway there, and then you just kind of put together the pieces.
Totally.
Um, so one of the themes, another theme that I noticed was blood. And I think that's so specific because you had like a cardiac event. Um, but can you speak to the way that blood is the lifeblood haha, of this collection, and how blood appears and disappears in these poems?
Sure. Yeah. I think blood is such like a versatile metaphor, and at the risk of it being cliche because it's so easy to use for like so many different things, but like truly it is so like blood is violence, blood is history, blood is family, blood is inheritance. So just with that, like you can accomplish so many things with this one image. And like it can have so many connotations to it. um, and I think like blood was like the literal thing that sparked a lot of this work, right? So I have yeah, I don't know if there's like a name for this condition, but I go into vasovagal syncope whenever I like see my own blood. So it's just like a phobia of blood essentially. And that was sort of like the onset of the event that like this book is about, really. And so it was very much just like, oh, this image is very versatile, ties all of this together in a very concrete way, um, and is very evocative. I don't know. I just feel like blood has so many like layers of meanings for so many people that it's easy to read into it what you want to read into it.
Yeah, I loved the one where you talk about how blood is just salt and water, and then there's like a little bit left, but you don't really talk about what that thing is.
Mm,
I loved that
yeah.
one.
Thank you.
Um,
Yeah.
so we're gonna pivot a little bit. Who's in your canon? Uh,
Mm.
who are you engaging with, maybe while you were writing the book, but also in your kind of current daily canon?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's generous of you to imply that I have the opportunity to like engage thoughtfully with poetry on a daily basis right now.
I think we all wish that we did. I can't say that I do. It's mostly for work, but
Yeah.
we try.
No, no, like I appreciate the question. I think that's really good because I do think that like right now versus when I was writing this art is a little different. I mean, definitely when I was writing this, I was reading a lot of Sam Sachs. I was reading a lot of Ocean Vuong, and those are both two poets who like I think I have poems after them in this collection. Yes. Oh, beautiful. Exactly. What that is that like an old one of their old like chapbooks from like 2015 or something?
It is.
That's
It's just
amazing.
sitting on my desk. I haven't even read it yet.
Yeah. Yeah, that's rad. But like definitely Ocean's first collection, Night Sky with Exit Wounds, was like a huge part of this because I think I don't know, there's just so many echoes of that book in XV for sure. Just like family relationships, intergenerational trauma, like relationship, like parental relationships, and that sort of stuff. I don't know. I think of Sam and Ocean as both people who just can be so tender and like, it's beautiful. Um, More recently, I think, sort of along that same vein, Eduardo C. Corral is like somebody who I just think can do no wrong. Like I love every single thing I read from Eduardo, and I've never actually met him in person, but like I just if I could, I just want to be like how like Slow Lightning changed the way I write 100%. Um, and then Patricia Smith, just as also somebody who like comes from the world of poetry slam and is like truly 100% original, and sort of showed everyone what you could do with the form and like with form in general. I feel like there has been a real renaissance of form in the last few years. And maybe I'm just saying that being someone who like is mostly in spoken word spaces, but like definitely in spoken word spaces, there are a lot of people using forms these days. And Patricia Smith, in my mind, is like the first person to do that. So she's amazing. Yeah. And then I don't know, I feel like there's just a lot of anybody who's doing weird, like neo-formal shit, and just like nonce form and whatever, like any of that stuff. Like I took a class with Sam Sachs a year ago or something that was like all online, but it was all about form and voice. And we just did so many weird things that I loved. And like that is really what's driving a lot of my work these days. Yeah, so those are some of the people.
I think that's a great list.
Thanks.
We are kin.
That's what's up. That's what's up. Yeah.
Yeah, so what are your thoughts on the way that love manifests in the face of a crisis? I thought that was another theme that I pulled out of your chapbook.
Yeah, totally. I feel like in some ways it's similar to your first question about destiny, that like it feels like such a romantic and like fantastical notion, which doesn't make it, in this case, I don't think that's necessarily bad or like wrong or anything like that. But I do think it can be dangerous to like to imagine love as like a thing that can only manifest when you're in this like terrible, dangerous place. I actually have a line from like an older poem that it's something like, you can't really love someone until you go through a disaster with them. And like, I don't know, sometimes I just like, I'm like, Zach, were you being sincere when you wrote that? Or were you like kind of being a little punk? And like, do you want like, is that really what you feel? Or like, did you write that with the intention of subverting it? And I don't know what I was thinking when I wrote that when I was like 22 or something, but I just like, I don't think that that's true. I think that disaster and like chaos and whatever will help facilitate the building of connection in some ways, much in the same way that like any sort of like bond, like trauma bonding, right? Like I used to have such I would make so many friends through like very intense and very limited events, if that makes sense. Not even necessarily traumatic, but just like, oh, like we are counselors at the same summer camp for like 8 weeks, and like we are the only people who we see for these 8 weeks, and therefore we must by necessity develop some sort of relationship. And like many of those relationships are legitimate and valid and great, and I still have great friends who I met in these ways. And also I think it's not necessarily a good move to like build all your relationships out of that sort of necessity.
Well, I think that being a counselor at summer camp is kind of like being in a crisis.
I mean, yeah, honestly, yes, but maybe to a different degree, but like totally.
Yeah, definitely. That was a great answer. Can you talk about and this comes from the cover, but can you talk about the metaphor of the goldfish, collective memory, and how generational trauma and also generational healing can be passed on?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of like how that poem developed, because like I was in a zone where I was writing a lot of persona pieces, and I was always like, is this persona like helpful? Like, what is it? What am I actually doing with it? And I think the thing about the goldfish poem is that it's very vague, or like it's very I don't know, like there's not a lot of like you have to read it in context, I guess is what I'm saying. Because like when I wrote that poem and I finished it, and I was like, what is this fucking poem about? Like what are you actually trying to like do here? And then it went through a lot of different like zones where I was like, oh, like maybe this poem is about like whiteness, or like maybe this poem is about like the Jewish experience in America. Maybe this poem is about like intergenerational trauma, which I think it is about. It can be about all of these things, and I think it is a very pliable like metaphor. Like it is definitely about the like trauma of my father and his father and like all of these traumatic events. And I think much in the same way that we've sort of gotten into, I feel like the purpose of the poem is to like disprove itself, like sort of what we were talking about in terms of both like destiny and like the developing love in the face of like a disaster. Like the poem, it's called Debunking the Goldfish, right? So I'm sort of being like, hey, just because you can't actually like remember a thing, just because like it's not really there and able for you to pull it up in that way, doesn't mean that does not affect you. And I think that's hard for a lot of people, or like not necessarily fully understood. So I was trying to like dig into that and get at that. And I don't know, I don't know how to answer your question as it relates to healing, because that is, I think, beyond the scope of the poem. That's beyond the scope of the poem for sure, I think, anyways. But like, I don't know, I think that is the right question. Like I think that is what I would love to know as well.
I just
I don't
pulled
know.
I just pulled out of the Glass essay. My questions were not original, nor did I answer them. I've been thinking about that all today.
I haven't read that. Wait, say more.
Anne Carson's The Glass Essay.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I think about that line every day.
I mean, yeah, I think that's honestly kind of how I feel about this poem. Like, I thought it was a really fun exercise, and I really like reading that poem because it's such a silly and weird character to like take on, but it needs to have the context of the rest of the collection, or it needs to have other context, or it doesn't accomplish what I would like for it to accomplish, you know?
Yeah, definitely. I was just looking at it while you were talking, and I was trying to debunk my own goldfish.
Yeah, totally. Do that.
Yeah, so last question. What's next? You won the 2021 Button Chapbook Contest. Is that chapbook out now, or yeah, it is?
It's not. Yeah, so they optioned me for a full length from that contest, which is awesome. Yeah. And I turned in my first draft of that manuscript like a month ago. So starting the editing process, and don't have a pub date or anything like that, but I'm very excited. The book is, I feel, definitely related to XV in a lot of ways. There's still a lot of like family. There's still a lot of intergenerational trauma and just like I hope intergenerational healing as well. That would be great. But it is definitely a lot more formal. I think, as like I alluded to earlier, that like I got very into form and nonce form, and like there's some really weird stuff that I tried to do with the page, and with form. And then it's also very like sociological and like historical in some ways. Like it's an exploration of like, it is very much about the Jewish experience in America and like Jewish American identity, and like how that relates to, you know, nationality and race and masculinity and queerness. And like there's a lot of different layers there, and sort of what we were talking about like way before. I feel like the chapbook as a form is helpful because it is so small by necessity, so it limits you in like a helpful way. And like this book feels like it can keep like ballooning in different directions, which is cool because there's space for a lot of things that I'm interested in. But at the same time, I'm like, okay, I need this to be somewhat again, the poems all need to live in the same world. And so I think that's what I'm like interested in finding out through the editing process.
Okay, that's great. That sounds amazing. I can't wait to read it.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
I can't wait to reach out to Button and get that manuscript.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Zach, for being here. And thank you for engaging with poetry with us.
Yeah. Thanks so much for talking to me.